The early inheritance. The fluorescent lights above my hospital bed hummed with an electric persistence that matched the rhythm of my heartbeat on the monitor. 72 hours ago, I had collapsed in my garden while tending to the roses. The same roses I'd planted when David and Sarah were children. The same roses that had witnessed birthday parties, first dates, and graduation celebrations. Now, as I lay here with tubes snaking from my arms and the bitter taste of medication coating my tongue, those roses felt like they belonged to someone else's life. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore? The nurse's voice cut through my fog of pain medication. Your daughter is here to see you. Sarah swept into the room like she always did, purposeful, efficient, her designer heels clicking against the linoleum floor. At 43, she had inherited my stubborn jaw and her father's calculating eyes. Behind her trailed my son, David, 38 years old and still carrying himself with the uncertain posture of someone who had never quite found his place in the world. Mother, Sarah's kiss on my forehead was brief, clinical. How are you feeling? The question hung in the sterile air between us. How was I feeling? Like my chest had been crushed by an invisible weight? Like every breath was borrowed time? Like the woman who had raised 2 children, built a successful real estate business from nothing, and survived the loss of her husband 5 years ago, was now reduced to this frail figure in a hospital gown. I've been better, I managed, my voice hoarse from the breathing tube they'd removed that morning. David stepped closer to the bed, his hands fidgeting with his phone. The doctors say you're stable now, Mom. That's good news, right? I studied my children's faces, searching for the warmth I remembered from their childhood. Sarah's expression was carefully controlled, the same look she wore during difficult real estate negotiations. David kept glancing at his watch, then at Sarah, as if they were sharing some private schedule I wasn't privy to. Yes, I said slowly. The cardiologist thinks I'll make a full recovery. It might take some time, but time, Sarah interrupted, settling into the visitor's chair with the air of someone preparing for a business meeting. That's actually what we need to discuss with you, Mother. Something cold settled in my stomach that had nothing to do with my medical condition. What do you mean? David cleared his throat, a nervous habit he'd carried since childhood. Well, Mom, we've been thinking about your situation. The house is so big, and maintaining it while you recover, it's going to be challenging. I can manage. Can you? Sarah's voice carried that sharp edge I remembered from her teenage years, when she'd argue about curfews and car privileges. Mother, you collapsed in your garden, alone. You could have died out there and no one would have found you for hours. The words hit me harder than they should have. It was true. I had been alone. Since Richard's death, the silence in our 4-bedroom colonial had become a constant companion. But it was my silence, my solitude, chosen and carefully cultivated like my roses. I have my medical alert system, I said weakly. Which you weren't wearing when you collapsed. Sarah opened her purse and pulled out a manila folder thick with papers. David and I have been discussing this extensively. We think it would be best if you considered improving your living situation. The folder landed on my bedside table with a soft thud that seemed to echo through my chest. Even without opening it, I could guess its contents. Brochures for assisted living facilities, articles about the benefits of senior communities, perhaps even real estate listings for condos and retirement apartments. You want me to sell the house. The words came out flat, emotionless, though inside I felt something beginning to crack. We want you to be safe, Mom, and comfortable. There are some beautiful places where you'd have help if you need it. Activities, people your own age. People my own age. I laughed, a sound that turned into a cough that made my chest ache. David, I'm 68, not 98. But you're not getting any younger, Sarah said, her patience clearly wearing thin. And that house, it's too much. The stairs, the yard work, the maintenance costs. Do you know how much you spent on repairs last year alone? I did know, actually. I knew because I had paid every bill, managed every contractor, made every decision about my home and my life. The house wasn't just too much, it was everything. It was where I brought my babies home from the hospital, where I'd nursed them through chickenpox and heartbreak, where Richard and I had dreamed about retirement, about growing old together among the memories we'd built into every room. "I'm not ready to give up my home," I said quietly. Sarah's jaw tightened. "Mother, please be reasonable. We're not asking you to give up anything. We're asking you to make a practical choice about your future." But as I looked at my children, my successful, accomplished children who had their own homes, their own families, their own busy lives, I realized that my future was exactly what we were discussing. And somehow, without my permission, they had already begun planning it. "I need time to think about this," I said finally. "Of course," Sarah said, but her tone suggested that my thinking time was merely a courtesy, not a genuine option. "Take all the time you need. We just want what's best for you." After they left, I lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the hospital around me. The soft ping of monitors, the whispered conversations at the nurse's station, the distant sound of someone crying behind a closed door. I thought about my house, sitting empty now, the roses blooming unattended in the garden. I thought about the photo albums in my closet, the Christmas ornaments in the attic, the collection of my grandmother's china that I'd promised to pass down to Sarah someday. I thought about all the ways a life could be measured and quantified, reduced to practical decisions about square footage and maintenance costs. But mostly, I thought about the look in my children's eyes when they'd talked about my future. Not grief at the thought of losing their childhood home, not concern about uprooting me from the place where their father and I had been happiest, just calculation. Cool, careful calculation about what would be most convenient for everyone involved. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but every time I drifted off, I dreamed about strangers walking through my house, measuring my life in square feet, and asking about the price per room. Chapter 2. The Silence. Recovery is a funny word. It suggests a return to something that was lost, a restoration of what once was. But lying in that hospital bed for the next 4 days, I began to understand that some things, once broken, reshape themselves into something entirely different. My children visited every day, bringing flowers and updates about my situation. Sarah had contacted 3 different real estate agents to get market assessments on the house. David had printed out information about senior living communities within a 20-mile radius. They spoke about these preparations as gifts, as evidence of their love and concern. "We're just being proactive, Mom," David explained during one visit, his fingers drumming against the plastic chair. "It's better to explore your options while you're recovering, rather than waiting for another emergency." Another emergency. As if my heart attack was just the first in an inevitable series of catastrophes that would define my remaining years. "Have you given any thought to what we discussed, Sarah?" asked on Thursday morning, her voice carrying the practiced patience of someone accustomed to closing deals. "Some," I lied. The truth was, I thought of little else, but my thoughts hadn't led me to the conclusions my children were hoping for. "And?" Sarah's pen hovered over her ever-present notepad, ready to record my compliance with their plans. "And I think I'd like to go home first, to see how I feel there, to make sure I'm making the right decision." The silence that followed was loaded with frustration. Sarah and David exchanged one of their meaningful looks, the kind that made it clear they had discussed me extensively in my absence. "Of course, Mother, but promise us you'll keep an open mind about the other options." I promised, though I wasn't sure what I was promising or whether I meant it. Dr. Patel discharged me on Friday morning with a pharmacy's worth of medications and strict instructions about rest, diet, and gradual activity increases. Sarah had offered to drive me home, but at the last minute, she was called away to handle an urgent client situation. David took her place, though he spent most of the drive fielding phone calls about his own work crisis. As we pulled into my driveway, I felt a rush of relief so intense, it brought tears to my eyes. The house looked exactly as I'd left it. The white shutters bright against the blue siding, the oak tree casting familiar shadows across the front porch. my flower boxes still blooming with the petunias I'd planted in spring. "I can help you get settled in," David offered, though he was already looking at his phone again. "I'll be fine," I said, and for the first time in days, I meant it. Inside, the house wrapped around me like a favorite sweater. Every creak of the floorboards, every play of afternoon light across the hardwood floors, every familiar scent of home and history. It all confirmed what I'd known in my heart, but had been afraid to say out loud. I wasn't ready to leave this. I might never be ready. I spent the afternoon moving slowly from room to room, reacquainting myself with my own life. In the living room, I touched the piano where Sarah had practiced scales for 7 years, where David had pecked out chopsticks with stubborn determination. In the kitchen, I ran my fingers along the counter where I'd prepared thousands of meals, where Richard had sat with his morning coffee, reading the newspaper aloud to me. By evening, I was exhausted, but more certain than I'd been in weeks. This house wasn't just where I lived, it was who I was. Every room held pieces of my story, chapters of a life I wasn't ready to close. I called Sarah to let her know I was home safely. "How are you feeling?" she asked, though her tone suggested she was multitasking. "Good. Really good, actually. Being home makes such a difference." "That's wonderful, Mother. Listen, I know you're tired, but I wanted to let you know that David and I have been talking, and we think it might be helpful if we arranged for someone to check on you regularly, just until you're fully recovered." "What kind of someone?" "A home health aide, or maybe a housekeeper who could also provide some companion services. Someone to make sure you're taking your medications, help with grocery shopping, that sort of thing." The suggestion felt like a door being slowly closed. "Sarah, I'm perfectly capable of managing my medications and my grocery shopping." "Of course you are. This would just be temporary, for our peace of mind." "Our peace of mind. Not mine. Theirs. I don't need supervision," I said more sharply than I'd intended. "It's not supervision, Mother. It's support. There's a difference." But I was beginning to understand that the difference was largely semantic. Support became supervision, became control, each step presented as being for my own good. After we hung up, I sat in my living room as darkness settled around me. The house was quiet, but it wasn't the oppressive silence of the hospital. This was the peaceful quiet of home, filled with memories and possibilities. I made myself a simple dinner and took my medications without assistance. I watched the evening news and read a few chapters of the mystery novel I'd started before my heart attack. I performed all the ordinary activities of living, the same activities my children seemed to believe I was no longer capable of managing alone. That night, I slept in my own bed for the first time in a week. And for the first time since my collapse, I didn't dream about strangers in my house. I dreamed about roses blooming in an empty garden, growing wild and beautiful with no one to tend them. Chapter 3. The Discovery. The phone call came at 7:23 a.m. on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after I'd returned home. I remember the exact time because I was sitting at my kitchen table with my morning coffee, watching the sunrise paint my garden in shades of gold and amber. "Mrs. Whitmore? This is Janet Morrison from Morrison Real Estate. I understand you're considering selling your property?" The coffee cup slipped from my fingers, shattering against the kitchen floor in an explosion of ceramic and hot liquid. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I think there's been some mistake." "Oh, I don't think so. I have a signed consultation agreement here with your children, Sarah and David Whitmore, acting as your representatives. They've asked me to prepare a market analysis for your property at 427 Maple Street." The kitchen floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles white against the wood. "I never signed any consultation agreement." "Well, no, ma'am, but your children have power of attorney for health and financial matters, and they felt it was important to explore your options while you recover from your recent medical event." Power of attorney. The words hit me like a physical blow. I remembered signing documents in the hospital, stacks of papers that Sarah had brought while I was still groggy from pain medication. "Just routine paperwork, Mother.
Insurance forms and medical authorizations. Nothing for you to worry about. I need to call you back." And I hung up before Janet Morrison could respond. My hands shook as I dialed Sarah's number. "Mother? Is everything all right? You sound upset. I just received a call from a real estate agent. She says you and David have power of attorney and that you've asked her to prepare a market analysis for my house." The pause that lasted an eternity. "Mother, please don't be alarmed. We can explain everything." "Explain what? That you've been planning to sell my house without my permission?" "Of course not. We would never sell your house without your permission. We're just gathering information so you can make an informed decision when you're ready." But her words felt hollow, rehearsed, as if she'd prepared for this conversation and scripted her responses in advance. "I want to see those power of attorney documents." "Certainly. David and I can come over this evening and review everything with you." "But Mother, I want you to understand we only did this because we love you and want to protect you." "Protect me? From what? From making my own decisions about my own life?" After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen, surrounded by the broken pieces of my coffee cup, and I began to understand how thoroughly I had been betrayed. They arrived at 6 o'clock sharp, Sarah carrying her briefcase and David clutching a folder of documents. They settled at my dining room table, the same table where we'd shared thousands of family dinners, and spread the papers before me like evidence in a trial. The power of attorney documents were extensive and professionally prepared and legal. Completely, irrefutably legal. "You signed these in the hospital," Sarah explained, her finger pointing to my signature on page after page. "You were concerned about what would happen if your condition worsened, so we arranged for temporary power of attorney to ensure your affairs could be managed properly." I stared at my own signature, trying to remember the moment I'd written it. But those first days in the hospital were a blur of pain and medication and fear. I could have signed anything. "Temporary?" I repeated. "Well, yes, until you're fully recovered and able to resume handling your own affairs." "And who decides when I'm fully recovered?" David shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "The doctors, of course, and us. We're in the best position to evaluate your capacity to manage complex financial decisions. Complex financial decisions, like whether to sell my own home." "I see." I gathered the documents, stacking them neatly before me. "And the real estate consultation? We thought it would be helpful to have current market information, so that when you do decide to downsize, you'll know what your options are." "When I decide to downsize, not if. What else have you arranged on my behalf?" Another pause, another exchange of loaded glances between my children. "We've made some preliminary inquiries about care services," David admitted, "and we've looked into a few senior living communities, just to understand what's available." "Show me." Sarah hesitated, then opened her briefcase and pulled out another folder. This one was thick with brochures for retirement communities, printouts of care service companies, and what looked like financial worksheets calculating the costs of various living arrangements. But it was the document on the bottom of the pile that made my blood run cold. It was an application for Sunset Manor assisted living, partially filled out in Sarah's neat handwriting. Under resident name, she had written Eleanor Margaret Whitmore. Under move-in date, she had written October 1st, just 6 weeks away. "This is an application," I said, my voice deadly calm. "It's just a preliminary inquiry," Sarah said quickly. "Sunset Manor has a waiting list, so we wanted to secure your place in line. You can always change your mind later." But I could see the truth in their faces, in the way they couldn't quite meet my eyes. This wasn't a preliminary inquiry. This was a plan, a comprehensive, carefully orchestrated plan for my future that had been developed and implemented without my knowledge or consent. "How long have you been planning this?" I asked. "Mother." "How long?" David broke first. "Since Dad died, really. We've been worried about you living alone in such a big house. When you had the heart attack, it just confirmed what we already knew. You need more support than you're willing to admit." 5 years. They had been planning to uproot me from my life for 5 years, waiting for the right opportunity to present itself.
Get out, I said quietly. Mother, please, let's discuss this rationally. Get out of my house. Sarah began gathering her papers. We understand you're upset, but get out. The words erupted from me with a force that surprised us all. Sarah flinched. David actually took a step backward. They left, but not before Sarah placed a business card on the table. This is the number for our attorney, she said. When you're ready to discuss this reasonably, he can explain your legal options. After they were gone, I sat at my dining room table, surrounded by the wreckage of my trust in my own children. The brochures for Sunset Manor mocked me with their cheerful photos of elderly people playing cards and tending small container gardens. The power of attorney documents felt like shackles, legally binding constraints on my freedom disguised as protection. But it was the real estate consultation agreement that hurt the most, because it meant that while I had been lying in a hospital bed, fighting for my life, my children had been calculating its value in square footage and market comparisons. That night, I called my old friend Margaret, who had been widowed 2 years before Richard died. Eleanor, how are you feeling? I heard about your heart attack. I'm recovering, I said. And then, because I couldn't hold it in any longer, I told her everything. Margaret listened in silence until I finished, then said, Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. Have I been blind, Margaret? Have I been a fool not to see what my own children were capable of? You've been a mother, she said gently. We always want to believe the best of our children, even when the evidence suggests otherwise. What would you do in my situation? Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I'd fight. I'd fight like hell, because once you let them make one decision for you, it becomes easier for them to make the next one, and the one after that, until you're not living your own life anymore. You're living the life someone else has decided is appropriate for you. After we hung up, I walked through my house one more time, seeing it with new eyes. This wasn't just my home, it was my battlefield, and tomorrow I was going to war. Chapter 4. The Revelation. The law office of Peterson, Hartley & Associates occupied the entire third floor of a downtown building that smelled of leather and old money. I had dressed carefully for this meeting. My navy suit, the one I'd worn to close my biggest real estate deals, paired with the pearl earrings Richard had given me for our 25th anniversary. I was not going to appear as a frail, confused, elderly woman who needed protection from her own decisions. James Peterson was younger than I had expected, perhaps 50, with prematurely gray hair and the kind of expensive eyeglasses that suggested success. He greeted me with professional warmth and ushered me into his office, which was lined with law books and framed diplomas. Mrs. Whitmore, I understand you have some concerns about the power of attorney arrangements your children have made. I want them revoked, I said without preamble. All of them, immediately. Mr. Peterson opened a file on his desk and reviewed the documents. I've examined the paperwork, and I have to tell you, everything appears to be in order. You signed these documents of your own free will while mentally competent, and they were properly witnessed and notarized. I was in the hospital. I was heavily medicated. I didn't understand what I was signing. That may be true, but unfortunately, being medicated doesn't automatically invalidate a legal document, particularly when it was signed in the presence of medical professionals who can attest to your mental state at the time. The hope I'd been nursing began to wither. So, there's nothing I can do? I didn't say that. Mr. Peterson leaned back in his chair, studying me with sharp eyes. The power of attorney is currently active, but there are several ways we might challenge it. We could argue that you were under duress, that you lacked the mental capacity to understand the documents, or that your children are not acting in your best interests. They're not, I said firmly. They're trying to sell my house and put me in a nursing home against my will.
That's more complicated than it might appear. Legally, they have the authority to make financial and healthcare decisions on your behalf if they believe you're unable to do so safely. The question is whether their assessment of your capacity is accurate. I'm perfectly capable of making my own decisions. I believe you, but we need to prove it legally.
I'd recommend having you evaluated by a geriatric psychiatrist who can provide professional documentation of your mental competency. If we can establish that you're fully capable of managing your own affairs, we can petition the court to revoke the power of attorney. It was a start, but I could see the lengthy legal battle stretching ahead of me. Months of evaluations and hearings and depositions, all while my children continued to make decisions about my life. How long would that take? Several months, possibly longer, if they contest it. And I should warn you, Mrs. Whitmore, your children have the resources to hire excellent legal representation. This won't be easy or inexpensive. I left his office feeling defeated. The fight I'd been prepared for was going to be longer and more costly than I had imagined. And meanwhile, my children were moving forward with their plans, secure in their legal authority to dismantle my life piece by piece. But as I drove home, passing the familiar landmarks of my neighborhood, I felt a spark of the same determination that had helped me build my business from nothing, that had sustained me through Richard's illness and death, that had carried me through 68 years of challenges and triumphs. If my children wanted to play legal games with my life, they were about to discover that they had underestimated their opponent. The next morning, I called Dr. Patel's office and scheduled a comprehensive medical evaluation. Then, I contacted Dr. Sharon Mills, the geriatric psychiatrist Mr. Peterson had recommended. Finally, I made an appointment with my financial advisor to review my accounts and investments. If I was going to fight this battle, I needed to arm myself with documentation proving that I was mentally, physically, and financially capable of managing my own life. But it was the call from David that afternoon that changed everything. "Mom, we need to talk. Something's come up." His voice carried a tension I hadn't heard since he was a teenager trying to confess to some misdeed. "What is it?" "It's better if we discuss it in person. Sarah and I can be there in an hour." They arrived looking uncharacteristically subdued. Sarah's usual brisk confidence was missing, and David seemed unable to sit still, pacing my living room like a caged animal. "What's going on?" I demanded. Sarah cleared her throat. "Mother, we need to tell you about something that happened while you were in the hospital. Something we should have mentioned sooner." My heart began to pound. "What something?" "There was a break-in at the house. While you were unconscious, someone broke in and, well, they took some things." "What things?" Another pause, another exchange of glances. "Some jewelry, Dad's watch collection, some of the silver from the dining room." I stared at them, trying to process what they were telling me. "Someone robbed my house while I was dying in the hospital, and you're just telling me now?" "We didn't want to worry you while you were recovering," Sarah said. "We filed a police report and contacted your insurance company. Everything's been handled." "What exactly was taken?" David pulled out a piece of paper, an insurance claim form. The list of stolen items was extensive. My grandmother's jewelry, Richard's Rolex collection, the silver tea service my mother had given us as a wedding gift, several valuable pieces of art. "This is over $50,000 worth of items," I said, staring at the list. "I know, but the insurance will cover most of it. And honestly, Mom, it could have been much worse. At least they didn't damage the house or take anything with real sentimental value." Real sentimental value. As if my grandmother's engagement ring and my mother's silver didn't represent decades of family history. How did they get in? "Through the back door. It looks like they had a key." A key. Something cold settled in my stomach. How would burglars have a key to my house? Sarah and David exchanged another of their loaded glances. "We're not sure," Sarah said carefully. "Maybe you gave a spare to someone, a contractor or housekeeper, and forgot about it." But even as she said it, I knew it wasn't true. I was careful with my spare keys, and I'd never given one to anyone except my children and Margaret next door. "I want to see the police report." "Of course," David said, but he made no move to produce it. Now, Sarah reluctantly opened her purse and pulled out a folded document. The police report was brief and clinical. Burglary reported by family members. No signs of forced entry. Multiple items of value missing. No suspects at this time. I read it twice, then looked up at my children. No signs of forced entry? That's what the police said. They think whoever did it was probably someone who knew the house, knew where you kept valuable items. Someone with a key? It's possible. But as I studied their faces, the way Sarah wouldn't meet my eyes, the way David kept fidgeting with his phone, I began to understand that this wasn't a burglary at all. You took them, I said quietly. What? Sarah's voice was sharp with indignation. Mother, how can you even suggest you took my jewelry and Richard's watches? You filed a false police report and an insurance claim for things you stole from your own mother's house while she was unconscious in the hospital? The silence that followed was deafening. David broke first, his face crumbling like a child caught in a lie. Mom, it wasn't like that. We were trying to protect your valuables. The house was going to be empty for who knows how long. So, you decided to protect them by stealing them? We didn't steal them, Sarah's composure finally cracked. We secured them. Those items are going to be part of your estate eventually anyway, and leaving them in an empty house was irresponsible. Part of my estate eventually? You mean after I'm dead? That's not what I meant. Isn't it? I stood up, my legs surprisingly steady despite the way my world was tilting around me. You've already divided up my life, haven't you? The house, the belongings, the insurance money. You've already decided I'm as good as dead. Mother, please, get out. We need to discuss this rationally. Get out of my house. This time, they didn't argue. They gathered their things and left, Sarah's heels clicking angrily across my floor, David's shoulders slumped in defeat. After they were gone, I called the police. I'd like to report a theft, I told the officer who answered. What was taken, ma'am? My life, I said. My children stole my life. It took some explaining, but eventually Officer Martinez understood what I was telling him. The burglary report filed by my children was fraudulent. The items they claimed were stolen were actually in their possession. And while they might have legal power of attorney, that didn't give them the right to take my property and file false insurance claims. This is a complex situation, Mrs. Whitmore. You'll need to file a formal complaint, and we'll need to investigate. I have to warn you, family disputes like this can get messy. Officer Martinez, I said, my family is already about as messy as it can get. Chapter 5. The Fight. The next few weeks passed in a blur of appointments, documentation, and legal maneuvering that felt like the most important battle of my life. Dr. Mills, the geriatric psychiatrist, put me through a comprehensive battery of tests that confirmed what I'd known all along. I was mentally sharp, emotionally stable, and perfectly capable of making my own decisions. Your cognitive function is excellent for someone your age, she told me as we reviewed the results. There's absolutely no medical reason why you shouldn't be managing your own affairs. The police investigation into my children's theft moved more slowly. Officer Martinez explained that because Sarah and David had power of attorney, the legal boundaries were murky. They claimed they had taken the items for safekeeping, not for personal gain, and the district attorney was reluctant to file charges without clearer evidence of criminal intent. But the investigation did accomplish one important thing. It froze the insurance claim. The insurance company, faced with allegations that the reported burglary was fabricated, suspended all payments pending the outcome of the police investigation. My children, meanwhile, escalated their own efforts. They hired Dr. Kenneth Walsh, a geriatrician who specialized in elder care assessments, to evaluate my capacity for independent living. Your children are concerned about your ability to safely maintain your current living situation, Dr. Walsh explained during his visit to my home. He was a thin man with cold eyes who seemed to be cataloging every dust mote and minor imperfection he could find. I'm managing just fine, I said, leading him through my spotless house. Perhaps. But I notice you have medications on your kitchen counter. That suggests some organizational challenges. And these stairs to the second floor could pose a fall risk for someone with your cardiac history. I wanted to point out that everyone keeps medications on their kitchen counter, and that I'd been climbing those stairs safely for 32 years. But I could see he'd already reached his conclusions before he'd walked through my front door. His report, which arrived a week later, recommended supervised living arrangements for Mrs. Whitmore's safety and well-being. It was a masterpiece of medical doublespeak that made my ordinary, independent life sound like a series of dangerous risks waiting to happen. But I had reports of my own. Dr. Patel's comprehensive medical evaluation confirmed that my heart condition was stable and well managed. Dr. Mill's psychiatric assessment documented my mental competency in detail. My financial advisor provided a statement showing that my accounts were properly organized and that I'd made no questionable financial decisions. Mr. Peterson used these documents to petition the court for revocation of the power of attorney. The hearing was scheduled for October 15th, 2 weeks after the move-in date Sarah had written on that Sunset Manor application. They're trying to force your hand, Mr. Peterson explained. If they can get you moved into assisted living before the hearing, it becomes much harder to argue that you're capable of independent living. I said, they can't force me to move. Actually, they might be able to. If Dr. Walsh testifies that you're not safe living alone, and if they can demonstrate that you're not managing your medical care properly, a judge might agree that supervised care is in your best interests.
The noose was tightening, and my children held both ends of the rope. It was Margaret who suggested the solution that changed everything. "What you need," she said over coffee in my kitchen, "is documentation. Not just medical reports and psychiatric evaluations. You need proof that you're living independently and managing your life successfully." "I am living independently. I know that, and you know that, but we need to prove it in a way that a judge can't ignore." She suggested I hire a private investigator to document my daily activities, to create a record of my independence that couldn't be dismissed or reinterpreted. "It sounds extreme," Margaret admitted, "but Eleanor, they're playing for keeps. You need to match their level of preparation." The investigator, a competent woman named Lisa Chen, spent 2 weeks following me around with a camera and notebook. She documented my trips to the grocery store, my visits to the bank, my doctor's appointments, my volunteer work at the library, my coffee dates with friends. She recorded my daily walks, my gardening, my housekeeping, my cooking. What emerged was a comprehensive picture of a woman living a full, independent, well-managed life. But it was what Lisa discovered about my children that truly changed the game. "I hope you don't mind," she said as she presented her final report, "but I did some additional research into your children's activities. I thought it might be relevant to your situation." The photographs she showed me hit like a physical blow. Sarah loading boxes from my house into her BMW, David carrying Richard's golf clubs to his car. Both of them, on separate occasions, meeting with representatives from auction houses and estate sale companies. "This was all taken in the past 3 weeks," Lisa explained. "While you've been fighting to maintain your independence, they've been systematically removing items from your home." I stared at the photographs, my hands trembling. "They have keys." "Yes, and based on what I observed, they're not just taking things for safekeeping. They're preparing for a complete liquidation of your household." The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that for a moment I couldn't breathe. While I'd been focusing on legal battles and medical evaluations, my children had been quietly dismantling my life piece by piece. "There's more," Lisa said gently. She handed me another set of documents. "These are real estate records. Your daughter has been in communication with developers who specialize in buying properties for quick demolition and redevelopment. The house, my house, where I'd raised my family and built my life, was already being evaluated for its lot value, not as a home, but as raw material for someone else's dreams. How long do I have?" "Based on what I've observed, I'd estimate they're planning to move quickly after the court hearing. If the judge rules against you, they'll probably have you moved within days and the house on the market within weeks." That night, I sat in my living room surrounded by the gaps where my belongings used to be. The empty spaces where Richard's watches had been displayed. The bare spots on the walls where family photographs had hung.
the missing pieces of silver from the dining room cabinet. My children hadn't just stolen my valuables, they'd been erasing my history, one memory at a time. But as I sat there in the growing darkness, I felt something I hadn't expected. Clarity. For weeks, I'd been playing defense, reacting to their moves, trying to prove I was competent enough to live my own life. Now I understood that competence wasn't the real issue. Control was. They wanted control of my assets, my property, my future. And they were willing to destroy our family, fabricate medical concerns, and commit fraud to get it. Well, if my children wanted to play dirty, they were about to discover that I'd learned a few things about strategy during my 68 years of life. Chapter 6. The Counterattack. I called an emergency meeting with Mr. Peterson the next morning. "I want to change my will," I announced as soon as I sat down in his office. "Mrs. Whitmore, I understand you're upset about your children's behavior, but making drastic changes to your estate plan while you're in the middle of a legal dispute might not be wise." "I'm not making drastic changes. I'm making strategic ones." I laid out my plan. It was simple, elegant, and completely legal. I want to establish a trust, one that takes effect immediately, not after my death. I want to transfer ownership of my house and the majority of my assets into this trust, with myself as the sole beneficiary during my lifetime. Mr. Peterson raised his eyebrows. "That's actually quite clever. If you're not the legal owner of the assets, your children's power of attorney becomes largely meaningless. They can't sell a house you don't own or manage accounts that aren't in your name." "Exactly. And I want Margaret Harrison named as the trustee. She's been my friend for 40 years, and she's completely trustworthy. This will significantly complicate your children's plans. But Mrs. Whitmore, I have to ask, what happens if you lose the court hearing? If a judge declares that you're not competent to make these kinds of decisions, then at least my assets will be protected by someone I trust, not stolen by people who clearly don't have my best interests at heart." We spent the rest of the morning working out the details. The trust would be established immediately, with Margaret as trustee and myself as beneficiary. Margaret would have the authority to make decisions about the assets, but only with my consent as long as I was mentally competent. If I ever became incapacitated, she would manage everything according to detailed instructions I would provide. Most importantly, the trust would include a provision that if anyone attempted to have me declared incompetent for financial gain, they would be automatically excluded from any inheritance. "It's a nuclear option," Mr. Peterson warned. "If you do this, your relationship with your children will probably be irreparably damaged." "Mr. Peterson," I said, "my children have been stealing from me and planning to institutionalize me against my will. I think that relationship is already beyond repair."
"They've brought this on themselves, Eleanor," she said as we signed the papers. "You gave them every opportunity to treat you with respect and dignity, and they chose greed instead." The reaction, when my children discovered what I'd done, was exactly what I'd expected. Sarah called first, her voice shaking with rage. "Mother, what have you done?" "I've protected my assets from thieves," I said calmly. "You can't just give away your house. We have power of attorney." "You have power of attorney over Eleanor Whitmore's assets. But Eleanor Whitmore no longer owns those assets. The trust does." "This is insane. You're clearly not competent to make these kinds of decisions." "According to 3 different medical professionals, I'm perfectly competent. But feel free to try to prove otherwise in court." David called an hour later, his voice pleading rather than angry. "Mom, please, we can work this out. We never meant for things to go this far." "Didn't you? Then perhaps you can explain why my jewelry is in Sarah's safe deposit box and why my husband's watch collection is being appraised by auction houses?" The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. "You've been watching us," he said finally. "I've been protecting myself, something I apparently should have started doing 5 years ago." But it was the visit from their lawyer that really confirmed I'd struck the right nerve. Thomas Brennan was everything I'd expected. Expensive suit,
silver hair, the kind of practiced gravitas that came from years of intimidating opposing parties. He arrived at my door with documents and threats wrapped in legal language.
Mrs. Whitmore, I represent your children in this matter. I think we can resolve this situation amicably if you're willing to be reasonable. I'm listening. Your children are prepared to withdraw their application for assisted living placement and return the items they removed from your home for safekeeping. In exchange, you would dissolve the trust and restore the power of attorney arrangements. And if I refuse, then we'll be forced to pursue a competency hearing with the full weight of medical evidence that suggests you're not capable of making sound financial decisions. Creating this trust while under psychological duress from a recent cardiac event could be seen as evidence of diminished capacity. I smiled at him, the same smile I'd used to close difficult real estate deals for 30 years. Mr. Brennan, you're welcome to try. But I should warn you that I have evidence of your client's theft, fraud, and elder abuse. If they want to make this a public battle, I'm more than prepared to provide that evidence to the media, the police, and the court. His confident expression faltered slightly. Oh, what evidence? Photographs of them removing items from my home without permission, records of false insurance claims, documentation of their attempts to sell my house without my knowledge, medical evaluations confirming my mental competency, and testimony from neighbors, friends, and medical professionals about my children's behavior. I paused, letting that sink in. Here's my counteroffer, Mr. Brennan. Your clients will immediately return every item they've taken from my home. They will withdraw all applications for assisted living placement and all real estate consultations. They will formally relinquish the power of attorney, and they will stay away from me unless and until they're prepared to treat me with the respect and dignity I deserve as their mother. And if they refuse, then I'll see them in court, and I'll make sure that court hearing is covered by every media outlet in the city. Local woman fights children's attempt to steal her life should make an interesting headline, don't you think? Mr. Brennan left without another word. 3 days later, David returned my jewelry and Richard's watches. The items were delivered by a courier with no personal message, no apology, no acknowledgement of the pain they'd caused. But they were returned. Chapter 7, The Reckoning. The court hearing was scheduled for October 15th, but it was canceled when my children's lawyer filed a motion to withdraw their petition for guardianship. Officially, they cited changed circumstances and family reconciliation. Unofficially, I knew they'd realized they couldn't win. The power of attorney documents were formally revoked on October 20th. I sat in Mr. Peterson's office signing the papers that restored my legal autonomy and felt like I was signing a declaration of independence. How do you feel? He asked as I handed back the pen. Free, I said. For the first time in months, I feel free. But freedom, I was learning, came with its own costs. Sarah and David had maintained their silence since returning my belongings. No phone calls, no visits, no acknowledgement of the damage they'd done to our family. It was as if, having failed to control my life, they'd decided to erase me from theirs. I tried calling them, but Sarah's assistant always said she was in meetings, and David never returned my messages. When I drove by their houses, something I'd never done before, but found myself doing now, their cars were in the driveways, their lights were on, their lives were clearly continuing without me. It was Margaret who finally said what I'd been thinking, but hadn't been able to articulate. You're grieving, she told me over coffee one afternoon. You're grieving the children you thought you had. They're still my children. Are they? The children you raised wouldn't have stolen from you while you were unconscious in a hospital. They wouldn't have plotted to sell your house behind your back or tried to have you declared incompetent for financial gain. She was right, of course. The Sarah and David who had visited me in the hospital, who had spoken so smoothly about my options and my safety, were strangers wearing my children's faces. So, what do I do now? I asked. You live your life, Margaret said simply. You tend your roses and read your books and volunteer at the library and have coffee with friends who actually care about you. You do all the things they tried to convince you that you couldn't do alone. And that's what I did. I resumed my volunteer work at the children's literacy program. I joined a book club.
I took a watercolor painting class at the community center. I traveled to visit cousins I hadn't seen in years. I lived fully and independently, exactly as I'd been doing before my heart attack. But I also made changes. I updated my will, establishing clear charitable bequests and ensuring that the bulk of my estate would go to causes I cared about, rather than to children who had proven they valued my money more than my well-being. I documented everything: my daily activities, my social connections, my medical care, my financial management, creating a record that would make it impossible for anyone to question my competency again. Most importantly, I surrounded myself with people who valued me as a person, not as a source of future inheritance. The holidays were the hardest part. Thanksgiving and Christmas had always been family celebrations, elaborate productions that I'd orchestrated in my dining room for decades. This year, I accepted Margaret's invitation to spend Thanksgiving with her extended family, and I hosted Christmas dinner for a dozen friends who would become more like family than my actual family. It was different, but it wasn't worse. In some ways, it was better. There was no underlying tension, no calculating glances at my china and silver, no whispered conversations about my future that excluded me from my own present. On New Year's Eve, I stood in my garden at midnight, listening to fireworks in the distance and thinking about the year that had passed. 12 months ago, I'd been a woman who trusted her children completely, who believed that family bonds were unbreakable, who assumed that the people closest to me had my best interests at heart. Now, I was a woman who knew better. But I was also a woman who had fought for her autonomy and won, who had refused to be diminished by other people's greed and selfishness, who had discovered that she was stronger and more resourceful than she'd ever imagined. Epilogue: The garden. 2 years later, I was in my garden when the letter arrived. It was from David, delivered by certified mail with the kind of official formality that suggested legal advice. The handwriting on the envelope was his, but the letter inside read like a document prepared by committee. Dear Mother, we hope this letter finds you well. David and Sarah have been doing a great deal of thinking about our relationship and the events of 2 years ago. We realize that we may have overreacted to our concerns about your health and safety, and we want to apologize for any distress we may have caused. We miss you and would like to rebuild our relationship if you're willing. Perhaps we could start with a simple visit or phone call to see if we can move forward together as a family. We love you and hope to hear from you soon. David and Sarah. I read the letter twice, then set it down on my patio table and continued weeding my roses. It was a beautiful spring day, and my garden was thriving. The roses I'd worried about during my hospital stay had not only survived, but flourished. They'd grown wild and abundant in some places, sending out new shoots and blooms that I'd never expected. There was a metaphor there, I thought. Sometimes the things we worry will die without constant tending turn out to be stronger than we imagined.